A young journalist, Anton, tired of routine news and thirsty for a big story, decided to go to a distant province to write an article about the abandoned village of Lesnoy. It was mentioned in old chronicles as a place with a dark history. Decades ago, the residents suddenly disappeared, as if they had evaporated, leaving their houses and belongings untouched. Now the village stood in the wilderness, surrounded by a dense forest, and locals from the surrounding villages avoided even talking about it. When Anton arrived at the village closest to Lesnoy, he felt the tension reigning among the locals. Everyone he approached for information avoided talking or answered briefly with obvious reluctance. "Don't go there, boy," said the tractor driver, lighting a cigarette. "People don't come back, understand? This place is alien." "What's so special about it?" Anton persisted, taking out his notebook. "Legends? Maybe something from the past?" The old man sitting on the porch only croaked. "Not legends, a curse. The very earth there is rotten. Something happened a long time ago, but no one will tell you what. Better forget the way there." But the young journalist was not going to back down. The more they refused to tell him, the more his interest flared up. He finally came across an old woman who agreed to tell more. "People in Lesnoye lived like everyone else," she began, her voice hoarse and tense. "But one night the village seemed to go crazy. Someone said they saw lights in the forest. Someone heard strange sounds. And in the morning, everything empty. Those who were alive left or disappeared, and those who remained, they say that their shadows still roam there." Anton, having written down her words, only smiled. "Ghosts, huh? Excellent, just what you need for an article." The old woman looked at him sternly. "You laugh, but in vain," she hissed. "That village does not like strangers. Once you set foot on its land, there will be no turning back." With these words, she fell silent, and no questions could make her speak anymore. Anton discarded the warnings as superstitions and headed toward Lesnoy. There was a long way ahead through an overgrown path leading deep into the forest. As he moved forward, the trees became denser and the air became heavier. It was as if the forest was drawing him into its embrace. When Anton finally reached the abandoned village, he felt a strange tension. The silence was absolute. Not a sound of birds, not a rustle of wind. Entering the first building he came across, he saw that everything looked as if people had left only yesterday. Dusty plates stood on the tables, clothes hung on hooks. However, the feeling of someone else's gaze did not leave him for a second. Anton walked along Lesnoy Street, looking at the slanted houses. Although the village looked abandoned, many of the buildings were remarkably intact. The windows were not broken, the doors were intact, and the roofs had only slightly caved in. The place seemed frozen in time, as if someone had simply gotten up and left, leaving everything as it was. He approached the first house, a low hut with faded paint on the walls. The door was slightly open, and Anton cautiously peered inside. There were wooden chairs in the room, an overturned table, and a clay jug with long-dried water in the corner. Dust lay everywhere, but strangely, none of the windows were broken. Not a single thing looked like it had been accidentally broken. Everything was untouched, as if the owners were about to return. "Strange place," Anton muttered, taking out his camera. He took several pictures, trying to capture the atmosphere, the stale air, the dim light filtering through the cracks, and the oppressive silence. As he left the house, he noticed something strange. The door he had left open was now closed. Anton froze, feeling a chill run down his spine. Probably the wind, he decided, although the forest around him was surprisingly still. The deeper he went into the village, the more he was overcome by the feeling that he was not alone here. At first, it was a barely audible whisper, as if someone was talking very close, but the words were indistinct, abrupt. Then strange sounds appeared, the creaking of floorboards, a knock similar to footsteps, and quiet laughter coming from afar. Each time Anton turned around, but saw only empty streets and silent houses. He decided to go into the largest hut in the center of the village, which, apparently, was the former administration. Inside, the same order reigned. Old books lay on the table, broken pencils were scattered on the floor. But, having gone up to the second floor, he heard a loud knock downstairs. "Who's there?" he shouted, but there was no answer. Gathering his courage, he went down. But the room was empty. However, the door through which he entered was now locked. Anton tried to open it, but it did not give in. And then he heard heavy footsteps behind him. He turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one in the room. Only a slight movement of air made the curtains on the window move slightly. At that moment, he felt himself surrounded by something invisible, cold, making his heart beat faster. "This can't be," he muttered, but the sound of his own voice seemed alien to him. The door suddenly swung open by itself, and Anton rushed outside, clutching the camera in his hands. But now he saw that the village was not completely empty. Silhouettes flickered in every window. They were not clearly visible, but they were clearly watching him. When the sun set, the village was plunged into thick darkness. Anton lit a lantern, but its light seemed weak, almost useless. The darkness around was too dense, as if the village itself did not want to be illuminated. He decided to stay in one of the houses for the night, choosing a hut with closed windows to avoid the feeling that someone was watching him. But this did not help either. First, he heard a creak, slow, drawn out, as if someone was carefully walking on old floorboards. Then, a dull thud was heard, as if something had fallen in the next room. If I don't find the ghost by morning, I shall not be able to sleep all night. Slowly, when he looked inside, the room was empty, but the floorboards were still swaying slightly, as if someone had just passed by. His breathing quickened, but he convinced himself that it was all nerves and imagination. Returning to the main room, he froze. A shadow appeared on the wall opposite him. It wasn't his shadow. It was moving on its own, growing larger, as if it were getting closer. Anton backed away, but tripped and fell. When he picked up the lantern, the shadow disappeared, but now the sound of footsteps was everywhere. There was something about what was stepping on the staircase with a kind of measured steps. He started to stop, afraid to get into shadow, and returned to the room to take a look again. One of them He ran out of the house into the street, gasping with horror. But the village had changed. It no longer looked empty. Silhouettes flickered in every window, as if something that had long lived in these houses had now decided to show itself. The shadows on the streets were becoming thicker. They merged, moved, stretched out, surrounding him. "This is impossible. This is just a dream," he screamed, but his voice echoed through the empty streets, as if dozens of other voices were picking it up. Anton ran, trying to find his way back to the forest, but wherever he went, he always ended up on the same street in front of the same house. The village was playing with him, making him wander in circles. At some point, he heard a familiar whisper, "Stay. You're ours now." The whisper came from everywhere, grew louder, turned into a chorus of voices. He reached the edge of the village and saw the forest, but the road was blocked by a wall of shadows, huge, moving, like a living barrier that was impossible to pass through. And then he understood. The village did not want to let him go. It had never let anyone go. He was a part of it, like everyone who had ever come here. The next morning, locals passing by the abandoned village noticed a new shadow on the main street. It did not belong to the trees or the old houses. It was motionless, as if it was waiting for the next guest.